The rock breathed a line of cold air. A seam in the mountain's flank, no wider than a body turned sideways, exhaled the deep chill of stone that had never felt the sun. On one side, the heat of the day pressed down, a weight of dust and shimmering distance. On the other, a sliver of absolute dark. And stood before it, feeling the two worlds on her skin. The sun baked the back of her neck while the air from the fissure raised goose flesh on her arms. Behind her, the territory stretched out, a bleached canvas of browns and pale ochres, empty of everything but the matron's final arithmetic. 3 girls, 18 years of age. 3 sacks of flour, 20 pounds each. 1 water skin, full. 6 days before the flour was gone. Perhaps 8 for the water, with care. The numbers had been delivered without malice, a simple calculation of doom. The world has no room for surplus, Matron Lowell had said, her voice as dry as the ground itself. It was not a judgment, merely a fact. And held the canvas strap of her sack, the coarse weave digging into her palm. Her sisters flanked her, their stillness a mirror of her own. Beatrice's gaze was fixed on the dark opening, her head tilted as if listening for a sound only she could hear. Catherine stared at her own feet, at the worn leather of her boots, as if the answer to their predicament was written in the dust. They had walked for 2 days, away from the orphanage that was no longer a home, into a landscape that promised nothing. The mountain range was a barrier, a final wall. The conventional path was to go around it, a week's journey to the next indifferent town. And looked at the crack. It was not a path. It was an interruption in the solid face of the world. She had seen it on a map in one of the matron's few books, a geological survey from years before, marked only as fissure, unexplored and anomaly. A place that did not fit the known arithmetic. "We go in," and said. Her voice was quiet, swallowed by the vast space around them. Beatrice did not look at her, but a small muscle in her jaw tightened. A nod. Catherine lifted her head, her eyes meeting Anne's. She asked no questions. She never did. She simply shifted the weight of her own sack, readying herself for the sideways passage. The world had no room for them, so they would try the place that was not part of the world. They would turn themselves sideways and slip through the seam, leaving behind the sun and the heat and the terrible, logical numbers that added up to their end. The rebellion was not loud. It was the simple act of 3 bodies turning to face the cold, dark breath of the stone. The entrance was a trial. The rock scraped at the canvas of their sacks, catching on the folded blankets tied to the outside. And went first, her shoulder pressed against one wall, her back to the other, inching her way into the mountain's core. The light from the entrance vanished after 20 feet, plunging them into a darkness that felt solid, a pressure against the eyes. The only sounds were the scuff of their boots on the gritty floor and the soft pant of their own breathing, amplified in the enclosed space. The air tasted of damp stone and something else, something clean and ancient, like the smell of a well. And kept one hand on the wall in front of her, her palm reading the texture of the rock, sometimes smooth and water-worn, sometimes sharp with crystalline edges. It was a language without words, a map of touch. She was the steady one, the one who had read the books, who believed in the logic of layers and strata, and she translated the feel of the rock into a promise of passage. Behind her, she could feel the presence of Beatrice, a warmth in the cold air. Beatrice was the quick one, the first to feel the shift in a room or the change in the weather. Here, in the absolute black, her senses seemed to sharpen. "Water," Beatrice whispered, her voice close to Anne's ear. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "I can smell it," and paused, listening. She heard nothing but their own movement, but she trusted Beatrice's senses more than her own. The scent was there, faint, but growing stronger. It was the smell of life. They moved deeper. The passage began to widen slightly, just enough that they no longer had to press themselves flat against the stone. The floor sloped gently downward. It was Catherine, the last in their line, who spoke next. The air is moving as she said it, and felt it too, not a draft, but a slow, almost imperceptible current against her cheek. It flowed from the darkness ahead, carrying the scent of water and damp earth. It pulled them forward. They walked in silence for what felt like an hour, or perhaps a day. Time had dissolved in the unvarying dark. Their world was reduced to the space their bodies occupied, the feel of the rock, the sound of their own hearts beating a steady, hopeful rhythm. Then, a change. A dilution of the black. A hint of grey far ahead, so faint and thought her eyes were inventing it. She stopped, and she felt her sisters stop behind her, a chain of held breath. The grey solidified, becoming a distant patch of soft, indirect light. It was not the harsh, white glare of the outside world. This light was different. It was gentle, filtered, and green. They began to walk again, faster now, their steps no longer shuffling but striding toward the promise ahead. The passage opened abruptly, not into a cave, but into a space so vast and unexpected that it stole the air from their lungs. They stood on a stone ledge, silent, looking out into the impossible. Below them lay a valley, contained entirely within the mountain. It was not a cavern, it was a world, lit from above by a long, arching opening in the stone ceiling hundreds of feet overhead, a great slash of sky that filtered the sunlight into a soft, luminous green. The air was warm and humid, thick with the smell of wet soil, blooming flowers, and ripe fruit. A fine mist hung in the air, catching the light in a silver haze. Trees, heavy with fruit and had only ever seen in drawings, peaches, plums, and something that looked like a fat, yellow pear, grew in thick groves. Neat rows of green vegetables covered the valley floor, laid out with a precision that suggested cultivation, though there was no sign of who might have planted them. Flowers bloomed in chaotic profusion, carpets of blue and red and yellow spilling between the trees and along the banks of a narrow, clear stream that wound its way through the center of the garden. The sound of dripping water was everywhere, a constant, gentle percussion from the high walls, where moisture beaded on the rock and ran down in shimmering threads to feed the moss and ferns that clung to every surface. Anne's mind, accustomed to the brutal arithmetic of scarcity, struggled to process the sheer, illogical abundance. Her eye scanned the valley, trying to inventory, to measure, to make sense of it. The planner in her was overwhelmed by the data. Beatrice was the first to move. She took a step forward, her hand outstretched as if to touch the air itself. A small laugh escaped her lips, a sound of pure disbelief. She turned to her sisters, her face transformed by wonder. "It's real," she breathed. Catherine sank to her knees on the ledge, her sack sliding from her shoulder. She reached out and laid her palm flat on the mossy stone beside her, her fingers spreading wide, as if to assure herself of its texture, its coolness, its life. She looked up at Anne, her expression unreadable but for the wet shine in her eyes. And remained standing, her gaze fixed on the source of it all, the stream. It emerged from a fissure in the rock at the far end of the valley, bubbling up clear and cold before beginning its lazy journey. Water. Food. Shelter. The three pillars of survival, presented not as a struggle to be won, but as a gift freely offered. They had crawled through the narrowest of passages, leaving behind a world that had no space for them, and had found a place that was nothing but space, nothing but room to grow. The matron's numbers, the 6 days of flour, the 8 days of water, dissolved into meaninglessness. Here, time was not a countdown to extinction. It was a promise. A season. A long, green breath. The first day was for wonder. The second was for work. Anne woke on their ledge of stone to the soft, green light and the sound of her sisters already moving. She had slept with the tattered book of botany and geology tucked under her head, its familiar weight a small anchor in this new reality. While Beatrice and Catherine explored the stream and began her survey, pacing the edges of the valley, her mind a ledger of assets. 37 fruit-bearing trees of at least 5 varieties. 12 distinct types of leafy greens growing in discernible rows. A patch of tough-skinned goods. Root vegetables, their feathery tops indicating carrots and parsnips. She made notes on a piece of scraped leather with a nub of charcoal from their fire-starting kit. The book confirmed her identifications. The trees were old, well-established varieties, some she'd never thought to see. The place felt ancient, tended by time itself. Beatrice returned with her hands full of small, sweet plums, their skins the color of a deep bruise. Her face was stained with juice. "They're perfect," she announced, offering one to Anne. The taste was explosive, a concentration of sweetness and sun that felt like a sacrament. While Anne mapped the resources, Beatrice mapped the feeling of the place. She found the warmest spots, where the light lingered longest. She discovered a pool in the stream deep enough for bathing, and a thicket of flowering bushes whose scent was strongest at dusk. Catherine, meanwhile, had found their home. It was an alcove in the rock wall, 20 feet above the valley floor, protected by an overhang that kept it dry. The floor was flat, sandy soil, and the back wall was smooth. It was defensible, dry, and had a clear view of their entire domain. She had already started clearing it, her movements economical and precise. By evening, they had a system. Catherine managed the shelter, reinforcing the path up to the alcove with flat stones from the stream bed. Beatrice was the forager, the taster, her instincts guiding her to what was ripe and ready. Anne was the strategist, the preserver. She knew that this abundance could be fleeting. She began to think about seasons, about drying fruit, about storing roots for a time when the plants might not be so generous. Their communication was a language of shared labor. Catherine would point to a loose rock, and would nod and help her move it. Beatrice would hold up a strange-looking tuber, and would consult her book, and they would decide together whether to risk it. They spoke little, their energy consumed by the physical tasks of creating a life from scratch. Their evenings were spent in the alcove, a small fire of dry fallen branches casting dancing shadows on the rock. They would eat roasted vegetables and fresh fruit, the silence between them comfortable, filled with the weight of their shared fortune. One evening, Beatrice looked out over the valley, the green expanse darkening to blue in the twilight. "I wonder if she thinks we're dead," she said softly. And didn't have to ask who she was. Matron Lowell. The thought was like a cold stone in her stomach. "It doesn't matter," Anne said, her voice flat. But it did. The world outside, the world of arithmetic and scarcity, still existed. For now, they were safe in their secret garden. But the secret was a fragile wall between two realities, and Anne knew, with a certainty that chilled her, that one day they would have to reckon with the world they had left behind. Weeks turned into a month, then 2. The rhythm of the garden became the rhythm of their lives. They rose with the green light and slept when it faded. The initial awe settled into a deep, quiet gratitude, expressed not in words but in the care they took with their tasks. They were no longer refugees, they were tenders of this hidden place. Anne's leather map grew more detailed, a chronicle of their domain. She marked the progress of the ripening fruit, the locations of the best digging sticks, the places where the edible mushrooms appeared after a period of heavy mist. Using a sharp stone, she began to carve a calendar into the wall of their alcove, a series of lines to track the passage of time, to anticipate the cycles of the garden. She learned the language of the plants, the slight curl of a leaf that signaled thirst, the pale cast of foliage that asked for more sun. She and Catherine devised a system of irrigation, diverting water from the main stream through shallow channels to reach the drier patches of soil. It was hard, repetitive work, digging with flattened stones and their bare hands, but the sight of the dark, wet earth drinking greedily was its own reward. Beatrice brought beauty into their practical world. She wove mats from tough grasses to soften the floor of their shelter. She found clay by the stream bank and, with painstaking slowness, formed shallow bowls and cups, leaving them to harden in the warmest, sunniest spot on the rocks. They were lopsided and fragile, but holding one, warm from the sun, and drinking cool water from it was a luxury beyond anything they had ever known. She would gather flowers and place them in cracks in the rock walls of their home, small bursts of color that served no purpose but to please the eye. Catherine, the quietest of the three, became the architect of their small society. She expanded their living space, clearing a second, smaller alcove for storage. She built a sturdy stone hearth at the mouth of their cave, one that drew the smoke outward and kept the warmth in. Her hands were always busy, mending their clothes with fibers stripped from plant stalks, sharpening stones into rudimentary tools, reinforcing the path to their ledge. Her silence was a form of concentration, a deep and abiding focus on the physical integrity of their world. One afternoon, as they sat cleaning a harvest of small, purple-fleshed potatoes, Beatrice held one up. "It looks like the matron's heart," she said, her tone perfectly serious. Small and stony and almost choked on a laugh. Catherine looked up from her work, a rare, slow smile spreading across her face. The joke was a small thing, a bubble of warmth in their focused existence, but it felt significant. It was the first time they had spoken of the matron with something other than fear or resentment. Here, protected by a mountain, her power seemed distant, almost absurd. They were building a life that operated on a different kind of logic, not of subtraction and scarcity, but of growth and regeneration. They were becoming part of the garden, and it was becoming part of them. The change was subtle at first. A weakening of the current in the stream. A less vigorous bubble where the water emerged from the rock. Anne noticed it during one of her daily surveys. She stood for a long time at the spring source, watching. The flow had always been constant, a reliable pulse. Now, it seemed tired. She said nothing to her sisters, attributing it to a natural fluctuation, a brief dry spell in the world above that fed this hidden system. But the next day, the flow was weaker still. The water level in the bathing pool had dropped by a visible inch. The leaves on the plants farthest from the stream began to show the first signs of wilt, a slight loss of their vibrant green, a weary curl at the edges. The constant, gentle sound of dripping water from the high walls lessened, the silence it left behind feeling loud and ominous. The arithmetic returned. And found herself mentally calculating their stores of dried fruit, the number of goods they had harvested, the moisture content of the soil. The old anxieties, which had softened into the background noise of their lives, now sharpened into focus. The garden, their sanctuary, was fragile. Its life depended entirely on that single source of water. Without it, this green paradise would wither and turn to dust, a tomb within a mountain. Beatrice was the one who spoke it aloud. They were eating their evening meal, the silence heavy with the unspoken fear. Beatrice stared into the fire, her lopsided clay cup held loosely in her hands. "The water is dying," she said. The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. There was no panic in her voice, only a quiet statement of a terrible truth. Catherine stopped eating, her hand frozen halfway to her mouth. She looked at Anne, her eyes wide with a question she didn't need to ask. All their work, their planning, their careful construction of a life, it was all predicated on the assumption that the water would continue to flow. They had tamed a small corner of this world, but they had no power over its heart. And felt the weight of their gaze. She was the planner, the one who read the books, the one who was supposed to have the answers. But her books had no chapter on how to mend a dying mountain. The fear was a cold knot in her chest. For the first time since they had arrived, she felt the true, crushing weight of their isolation. There was no one to ask for help. There was no other place to go. The world outside had cast them out, and now the world inside was failing them. The green light of the valley, which had seemed like a promise, now felt like the glow of a closing trap. Despair was a luxury they could not afford. The next morning, Anne did not consult her inventory or calculate their dwindling chances. She went back to the source. She would not accept that the water was simply dying. Water did not die. It moved. It changed its course. Something had happened. Her book on geology, a dry text filled with diagrams of rock strata and aquifers, became her guide. She had read it out of curiosity, and now she read it with a desperate focus. She sat on the rocks near the failing spring, tracing the diagrams with a dirty finger, her mind working to connect the abstract drawings to the massive, living stone around her. The book spoke of faults, of subterranean rivers, of how pressure and time could alter the pathways of water through solid rock. The problem was not an absence of water, she reasoned, but a blockage. An interruption. While Beatrice and Catherine rationed their remaining water, tending to the most vital plants with a heartbreaking care, Anne became an investigator. She followed the dark, wet stains on the rock walls, tracing the ancient paths of seepage. She studied the lines and cracks in the stone around the spring, looking for any sign of a recent shift, a fresh break. She spent hours in silent observation, her mind quiet, her senses open. She learned to read the subtle language of the rock. A pile of fresh dust at the base of a wall spoke of a recent tremor. A hairline crack that was not on her mental map of the area was a clue. She was reframing the problem not as a curse from an indifferent world, but as a physical puzzle, something that could be understood and, perhaps, solved. Her sisters watched her, their trust a silent, steady pressure. They did not ask what she was doing. They simply continued their own work, conserving their resources, their faith in her a quiet act of rebellion against the encroaching drought. One afternoon, as she was examining the wall above the spring, she saw it. A section of rock, 20 feet up, seemed wrong. It was a jumble of smaller stones and packed earth, a messy scar on the otherwise solid face of the granite. It looked like a recent collapse, a choke point. The dark stain of moisture was visible above it, but below it, the rock was dry. The water was still there, trapped behind the fall. She felt a surge of something that was not quite hope, but a fierce, focused determination. She had found the wound. She went back to the alcove. Beatrice and Catherine looked up as she approached. "I know where it is," she said. That was all. It was enough. The quiet observation was over. The labor was about to begin. The work was brutal. The rockfall was in an awkward, almost vertical section of the wall above the spring. Reaching it required them to build a crude scaffold from the limbs of a dead tree they found in a far corner of the valley, lashing them together with rope they fashioned from fibrous vines. The structure was precarious, swaying with their weight as they climbed. For 3 days, they worked in a silent, synchronized rhythm, taking turns on the wall. The one on the scaffold would pry at the blockage with a sharpened digging stick, dislodging stones and packed dirt that rained down on the sister waiting below, who would clear the debris. The third sister would be resting, gathering her strength for her turn. Their hands were raw, their muscles screaming with a fatigue that went bone deep. Anne, methodical as always, directed the effort, identifying the key stones that held the dam of debris together. Beatrice, surprisingly strong, worked with a furious energy, her frustration with the dying garden channeled into the physical violence of her task. Catherine, with her steady patience, was the best at the delicate work, teasing out smaller rocks to relieve pressure without causing another, larger collapse. They spoke only when necessary, their communication reduced to single words. Pry clear hold, their shared purpose was a palpable force, a silent vow that they would not let their world die. On the 4th day, as Anne was working on the wall, she felt a shift. A large boulder, the linchpin of the blockage, moved a fraction of an inch under the pressure of her lever. "It's going," she called down, her voice tight with strain. Beatrice and Catherine scrambled back. With a final, desperate heave, and pushed. The boulder groaned, scraped against the rock, and then fell away with a deafening crash, followed by a torrent of smaller stones and packed earth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a trickle of water, dark with mud, seeped from the newly opened cavity. The trickle became a stream, then a gush. A wave of cool, clean water poured down the rock face, washing away the dust and grime, splashing into the basin of the spring below. It was flowing. And sagged against the wall, her arms trembling. Below, Beatrice let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Catherine stood perfectly still, her face turned up into the spray, letting the water run over her skin as if it were a benediction. They did not celebrate. They were too exhausted. They climbed down from the wall, their bodies aching, and simply sat together by the refilling pool, watching the water bubble and flow, listening to the sound they had been so afraid of losing. The garden was breathing again. They had faced their first great test not as victims, but as caretakers. They had learned the most important lesson of this place: it would provide for them, but they, in turn, had to provide for it. Their survival was not a matter of luck, but of labor. The bond between them, already strong, had been forged into something harder, something as resilient as the mountain that held them. 6 months after the water returned, the valley was more vibrant than ever. The near collapse had taught them a profound lesson in stewardship, and they now tended the garden with a new level of awareness and care. They had not just survived, they had thrived. Their larder was full of dried fruits and vegetables, their clay pots were numerous and well-made, and their small home was a place of comfort and security. They knew the rhythms of this place as they knew their own heartbeats. But the world outside still whispered at the edges of their consciousness. One evening, Anne was marking the passage of another week on their stone calendar. She looked at the accumulated lines, a physical representation of their time here. They had built a life, but it was a life without a name, a place without a title. In the eyes of the law, in the world of Matron Lowell, this place did not exist. And if it did not exist, it could not be theirs. If someone else were to stumble through that crack, by chance, what claim would they have? Their labor? Their love for the place? Those were not currencies the outside world recognized. The world recognized deeds, titles, lines drawn on a map. "We have to file a claim," she said into the quiet of the alcove. Beatrice, who was mending a tear in her tunic, looked up, her needle poised. "Go back." The question was soft, but it held the weight of all they had escaped. Not to stay, and clarified. To make this place real. To make it ours. Catherine looked from Anne to Beatrice. She said nothing, but she placed the tool she was sharpening down on the stone beside her, giving her full attention. The silence stretched. The idea was audacious. To walk back out of the mountain, not as failed orphans, but as landowners. To face the matron not with empty hands, but with proof of a world she couldn't imagine. "She won't believe us," Beatrice said. It wasn't an objection, just a statement of fact. "Then we make her believe," Anne replied. The decision settled. For the next week, they prepared. They were no longer assembling survival kits, but a portfolio of evidence. They packed small cloth sacks with dried peaches and plums, their flavor more intense than anything grown under the open sun. They gathered the strange, pale flowers that grew only in the deepest shade of the valley walls. They collected seeds from the most prolific plants. And on a large, carefully scraped piece of hide, and drew a map of their valley, the stream, the groves, the vegetable beds, the location of their home, a testament to their knowledge and their claim. They would not go back as beggars. They would go back as founders. When it was time, they stood at the entrance to the passage, the same place they had entered in desperation. The journey out felt different. They were not fleeing. They were advancing. They were carrying their world with them, ready to place it on the map. The sun of the outside world was a physical shock. After months in the filtered green light, the harsh glare was blinding, the dry heat an assault. They stood for a moment, letting their eyes adjust, the familiar landscape of their exile now looking alien and hostile. The orphanage was a 2-day walk, the same path they had taken away from it, but now they walked with a purpose that straightened their spines and firmed their steps. They were clean, their clothes mended, their faces filled out from a diet of fresh food. They did not look like the starving outcasts who had left. They looked like strangers. They arrived at the orphanage in the late afternoon. The building seemed smaller, grayer than they remembered. Matron Lowell was in the yard, overseeing the distribution of the evening meal to the remaining children, a thin soup, a crust of hard bread. The arithmetic of scarcity was still in effect. She looked up as they approached, her eyes narrowing. She did not recognize them at first. Then, a flicker of something, annoyance? Confusion, crossed her face. "You," she said. It was a flat, weary accusation. And stepped forward, Beatrice and Catherine falling into place beside her. They formed a solid line. They did not speak. And simply unslung the sack from her shoulder and placed it on the dusty ground. She untied the top and laid out their evidence on a rough blanket. The dried peaches, plump and golden. The pale, otherworldly flowers. The small, heavy bags of seeds. And finally, the map on its roll of hide. Matron Lowell stared at the display, her face a mask of exhaustion. Her gaze moved from the impossibly large dried fruit to the intricate map. She was a woman who lived by ledgers and measures, and what lay before her was immeasurable, an error in the world's accounting. She looked at Beatrice, then at Catherine, then finally at Anne. She saw not the defiant girls she had sent away, but 3 competent, self-possessed young women. The silence was long. The matron bent down, her knees cracking. She picked up one of the dried peaches, turning it over and over in her calloused fingers. She brought it to her nose, inhaling its sweet scent. She looked at the map, her finger tracing the line of the stream and had so carefully drawn. She was not a villain, just a person worn down to the bone by a world that never gave enough. And here, in front of her, was proof of an impossible surplus. She looked up at Anne, her eyes stripped of their hard authority, filled with a profound weariness and something else, a flicker of awe. "Where?" she asked. Her voice was a dry whisper. It was not a question of disbelief. It was a question of logistics. The first question one asks when planning a journey. It was the beginning of a new set of numbers, a new map. It was the sound of a world, ever so slightly, making room.